right now. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Toni Lynn to kick us off. Thanks a bunch, Toni Lynn.
Super, thanks. Glad to be here. I wish I was actually there. I guess, Abe, you're not there either. But I'm excited to be talking to the Acadia community about the work we've been doing because we started doing it together, like almost 5 years ago. So I'm Toni Lynn Morelli. I'm a USGS research ecologist at the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I'm going to kick off the talk and then hand it over to my collaborator, postdoctoral researcher, Tina Mozelewski, who is also affiliated with Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and University of Massachusetts. The work we're going to be talking about today is done in a translational ecology framework. So that is the idea of working together, ecologists, stakeholders, decision makers, to develop scientific research via joint consideration of all these different contexts of an environmental problem that results in improved decision-making. So you can think about all the people on the research side, feds and academics, et cetera, and all the people on the practice side, the managers, the people that are doing fieldwork right now, and the different ways that we consume information and produce information. Translational ecology tries to bring those people together and their ways of both consuming and producing information in order to improve decision-making. And critical to that is having these sort of principles of trust, collaboration, engagement, commitment, communication, good process, and actually decision framing context. All this is available in a special issue from Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. So there's lots of papers in there. I authored 4 of them, thinking about these ideas about translational ecology, putting it into practice, what's it mean? And so I'd be happy to talk more about that at the end. The other context we're working in with this project is climate change adaptation. So there's 2 ways of thinking about that kind of broadly out in the space right now. One is this kind of RRT framework, resistance, resilience, transition, with transition being maybe the most forward thinking, potentially the most kind of radical way of thinking about things where you're enabling transition to change. And through resilience, which is kind of enabling a system to bounce back from disturbance or stressors, and resistance. So that's mostly where we'll be talking from today, although there's some nuance there. The idea of, for particular priority areas, really enabling them to maintain what system they're in by, for example, reducing disturbances, like using fire breaks or intensive removal of migrants or invasive species. So you can see this scale from kind of promoting change and facilitating adaptive responses. And related, Abe Miller-Rushing and Abby Lynch and many others from the Park Service have put together this framework of RAD that you've probably heard about, resist, accept, direct. And you can see some of that here in this paper by Abby Lynch. There was a special issue in Bioscience that just came out. So I won't go into this too deeply, but just to say that both RAD and RRT have resist in them, and that's what we're mostly talking about today, thinking about refugia conservation. Although, again, we can talk a little bit later about how that can also be a context in which we do kind of transition or direct approaches. So what are refugia? Several years ago, a bunch of researchers and practitioners got together around a table and came up with a working definition of climate change refugia, that they are areas relatively buffered from contemporary climate change that enable persistence of valued physical, ecological, and sociocultural resources. Important maybe to the Park Service and partners there, it was this word valued that came in from our Park Service partners around the table. Something I wouldn't have thought to say, but it was really identifying that like these things aren't objective issues, they're subjective. We make decisions about what we care about and what we want to conserve. And then really focusing both not just on species, but also you can think about other aspects, sociocultural resources, which is certainly important when we think about the impacts of climate change in Acadia. So if you wanted an image of climate change refugia, you could go with this one. This is an idea of thinking about where would you find refugia on the landscape. Maybe that's in these topographically complex terrain or in deep lakes, or some places canopy cover can buffer temperatures. Cold groundwater inputs can be really important. Cold air pools, you can think about kind of that. And we've taken this idea, this is from our original paper, and in a couple of years ago, we put out a special issue on climate change refugia in Frontiers in Ecology and Environment, all freely available. And here are just some other examples that were written about there, like by Meg Krawchuk and Garrett Meigs on disturbance refugia. So fire, drought, forest pests. We can think about refugia from them. We can think about hydrological refugia. So here's an example of springs out west, but we are needing to think about hydrological refugia in the Northeast more and more as we keep getting these, as we're increasingly getting these intermittent droughts. Jim Thorne wrote about vegetative climate refugia, so places where vegetative communities stay together into the future, and he modeled those for the Sierra Nevada. And then other colleagues, including Becca Quinones from Mass Fish and Wildlife, produced a paper on Coldwater Refugia. And so this is just one view of that, looking at Coldwater Refugia, not just from the segment or stream segment perspective, but recognizing that there's also a connectivity requirement in this work. So we can't think about, especially with stream systems, but really in general, we can't think about isolated refugia. We have to think about how they're connected and kind of scale up. So we can like think about different local to regional scales when we think about refugia. We came up with this this process by which you can walk through both starting with identifying what do you want to conserve, and then how is it vulnerable to climate change, and then mapping that on the landscape, and ultimately using those refugia maps to prioritize actions that you would likely otherwise have taken, but often there's just too many places you want to do things. And so that's where this refugia prioritization comes in. And so we were able to pilot this idea led by Jen Smetzer under SCUDIC and Park Service funding. And we came for a workshop in person, actually, several years ago. And Jen produced great maps from the work, and there is a publication in draft that Abe is also involved in. So this project started with a workshop, which I'll talk about the process again iteratively. I'm going to talk about it over and over again because this is what we do, where we ask people, what is it that you want to conserve refugia for? And through a couple of days, we came up with examples like olive-sided flycatcher and black crowberry that represented different priorities, whether they were ecological or sociocultural or both. And then John Smetzer went ahead and modeled refugia for those species. So for example, you can see here maps of refugia for black-throated green warbler. And we can look, you can see it from the slider, you can kind of adjust for occupancy and adjust for the different climate change scenarios. And here's one for black crowberry, where we can see that that species is much more limited. And as we think looking into the future, there aren't that many refugia because it's actually not found in the first place very many places, and then is being more constricted into the future. So you can look at that sort of, if whether we choose the climate change scenario of 4.5, which is a more mild warming, or 8.5, which is more extreme climate change, you can see those changes where black crowberry seems unlikely to persist into the 2080 future under an 8.5 scenario. So that process was really exciting because Nick Fisichella then was able to take some of those results from some of the species and then actually working, I believe, with Abe and the Park Service, working to identify places where actions could be taken based on the refugia maps, and work that you've all been doing anyway on Cadillac Mountain was also kind of underlined by the work that came out of Jen Smutzer's refugia modeling. So that was really exciting. So again, there's a paper in draft for that work. And I wanted to spend most of our time here today talking about a broader National Park Service project we got under funding in collaboration with Abe, under funding from the Natural Resource Preparedness Program, or partners. I always forget what the other P is for NRPP. And so we have all this information on our website. I'll come back to that later, but just as COVID hit, literally like things closed down on a Friday in March and our workshop was on a Monday, we held these workshops. So it was the first kind of Zoom meetings for many of us. And we brought a bunch of partners together across the Northeast region, including some from Acadia, to co-produce, again, some refugia maps. What was important to map refugia for, and what actions might be taken once those maps were produced. This is a word cloud of kind of what the partners were saying that they really wanted us to focus on. And we did this iteratively. So here's the first pass, and then we went into small groups and we came back. And so this is sort of where we ended up in terms of what were the priorities for the National Park Service Northeast region partners. So it was both Park Service employees and also partners from NGOs and other federal agencies. And we ended up with these major topic groups. And then under those, identified species to model for. And so with that, I'm gonna pass the share off to my collaborator, Tina, and she'll tell you about the modeling portion of the project.
All right, hello. So this is a really lengthy list of species that came from those stakeholder workshops. And this list of priority species, it really runs the gamut from migratory bird species to several salamanders to sedges and tree species. And yeah, so there's a total of 40 of them, and just, I think, really represented the diversity of stakeholders that were in the room, kind of across agencies, across parks, across geographic boundaries in the Northeast. And the really fantastic thing that came from this work is that there were a bunch of different refugia products that were produced. So Toni Lynn kind of hinted at this, but so the first one that came out of this work was this fantastic map of Coldwater Refugia that was done by Ben Letcher and others. And so they mapped Coldwater Refugia in the Northeast, but I think more importantly produced this really phenomenal tool where if you are interested in identifying kind of these Coldwater Refugia locations throughout the Northeast, you can go in, find your priority region, and identify where those Coldwater Refugia are. They used brook trout as kind of their focal species, so defining Coldwater Refugia not only by temperature, but then kind of doing some occupancy modeling to look at where these refugia were going to be suitable for brook trout. And then there's also a project that mapped forest refugia. So here's an example from Acadia, but they mapped forest refugia throughout New England. And this was a project from Matthew Duveneck and Jonathan Thompson. And this has a really neat, for me, I guess, single degree of separation, because Matthew Duveneck and I had the same PhD advisor. He used the same forest model for these refugia results that I did for my PhD. But basically, they used a really complicated modeling framework and boiled it down into how tree species distributions are going to change over time in these parks, looking at 2050, 2080, and then across a couple different climate change scenarios, and identified climate change refugia for 8 different tree species in New England. We also have Wildlife Refugia Part 1. And so this came from the Designing Sustainable Landscapes project, but also I think of them just as kind of a crew, I guess, that was led by Ethan Plunkett and others based kind of here at UMass. And so they looked at, they did a really heavy lift. They did 23 species, wildlife species ranging from bear and moose to migratory birds to several different turtle species. And they looked at something called landscape capability, but basically looking at how this habitat suitability is going to change over time, including not just like how species climate envelopes are going to change, but also different prevalence models, and not just looking at landscape condition, but also how species populations are going to change over time to get this really robust metric of the ability of the landscape to host these species of concern over time. And so they did a total of 23. And then the last of the species, this is where I came in kind of towards the second part of this project. This was work that was done by a master's student that Toni Lynn and I co-mentored named Sarah Wisner for her thesis work. And so she looked at 9 different species, basically looking at of that massive list of 40 species of kind of conservation concern for climate adaptation. Sarah took on the ones that hadn't already been modeled. So she kind of wrapped things up with her thesis work. And so for each of the species that she was mapping refugia for, she did a species distribution model process that she really tailored to each species. So what are kind of the climatic and environmental variables that each of her focal species that were going to potentially limit the distribution or the range of each of her focal species. From there, for each of those species, she mapped both areas of climate change refugia under a couple different climate change scenarios, but I think really interestingly, she also mapped areas of transition. And so not just where are places on the land, like I think of climate change refugia, I guess my layman's definition is places on the landscape that are suitable habitat for your species now, and then we project to remain suitable habitat in the future, which is fantastic to know, because that may be where you want to focus your conservation efforts, right? If it's projected that your species is going to be able to persist there longer than other places on the landscape, then maybe that's where you spend a little extra time or money on your conservation. But these transition areas, I think, are also really useful because those tell you either species that are found in parks across the Northeast now and are projected to basically kind of range shift and move out of those parks in the future, or vice versa, species that aren't found there now, but are projected to kind of migrate in as climate change and time progress. And so Sarah mapped both of these across all of the Northeast, and then focused in on parks and identified, okay, so if we're looking at black-throated green warbler and we're looking at refugia across national parks in the Northeast, what percentage of refugia for this species is found in each park? And the goal in doing that is really to kind of facilitate cross-park management planning. So if one park has a ton of refugia for black-throated green warbler, but another park has the majority of refugia for beb sedge, then maybe you start thinking across kind of park jurisdictions about investing more in conservation for species where there's a ton of refugia in that park compared to a species where it's projected not to be found much longer. And so, yeah, so that I guess is kind of a quick, since we don't have a ton of time, summary of the Northeast work in the Northeast that's been done. Just really covering a ton of ground across taxa and really across partners working in the Northeast.
All right, and so I'm just going to switch back, and the last thing we want to talk about is what we do, what people can do with those maps. And so there have been some great examples around the continent so far about once refugia are mapped, how managers and practitioners can take action in those places. And so an example that's maybe farthest from thinking about down East Maine is Joshua Tree National Park, but it's really exciting. So Cameron Barrows and colleagues have done work to map refugia Joshua trees, and they do seem to be very vulnerable and sensitive to climate change. They are also sensitive to fire, and the fire story is an interaction between an invasive shrub, I believe, and higher susceptibility to fire. And like all of the resource managers around the country, maybe around the world, there's just not enough time to deal with all the invasives and prevent all the fires. And so what they were able to do was to map refugia for Joshua trees. Where are the places where they will likely persist into, to the end of the century? And those can be the places, and they did this work by looking for regeneration, which was really exciting too. So, they're trees. So if the babies are established and seem like they've gotten through that most vulnerable stage, they'll probably be there for a while. And there was a citizen science process aspect to the project as well. And then they were able to map where fires have been and where fire vulnerability seems high, and kind of those places that overlay refugia and fire. They then worked with the fire staff to really focus, if any fires come up in those areas, they're suppressed right away, whereas there could be other conversations about other places where fires come up, and then also to treat the invasive so the fires are less likely. Another example from work that got touched off from refugia modeling I did, I mapped refugial meadows in the Sierra Nevada, and those refugial meadows were then used to focus restoration efforts across the Sierra Nevada. So there are 10,000 meadows in the Sierra Nevada. There was funding with Forest Service, Park Service, Invasive Plant Council to restore some meadows. They didn't have funding to restore 10,000 meadows. They had to decide. And we were able to say, okay, well, here are the meadows that seem to be climate change refugia. And so that could help them act just at a filter in terms of which meadows to focus on. And so that was a really exciting project that kind of from start to finish, it started with a translational process of identifying meadows as a priority for managers all the way to taking the action. And so we can think about, well, there's, I guess, two more examples I want to give you. One is work that's happening out in Colorado, and they're thinking about identifying refugial places for conifers and then taking actions around that. So they have this sort of list of things that they'll do once they identify their areas, including the pinyon juniper and also sagebrush, and then kind of how they'll act on those refugia maps. There's also really exciting work that had come out of Minnesota, both in terms of aquatic refugia and conifer forests. So identifying, mapping, I believe it's TNC, sorry, mapping conifer refugia and working closely with the states, and then thinking about, they're calling them strongholds, but essentially refugia and how to manage those differently. Finally, to start where we began, thinking about the work that's happening in Acadia in terms of restoration, Cadillac Mountain and other places, that the decisions that are being made in terms of how to improve infrastructure and support park visitors, where at the same time maintaining ecosystem processes and connectivity for species. So that's where the refugia mapping that's been done in the last 5 years can potentially help to identify places that will be more buffered from climate change. And I hinted at this, so I just wanted to say that although we think about refugia conservation as a strategy for resistance, we can also think of it as kind of in the transition or direct box as well. And here's one way to do that from our Frontiers paper. So if we think about two places where moose can persist, and one of them is a refugium, this one on the bottom, and one of them is not. The one that isn't a refugium is going to warm faster and eventually not be able to support any of the species that we target for conservation. The refugium is for a while going to be able to continue to support moose, as an example, but it doesn't mean it's going to stop warming. It's just going to warm slower, we call it, in the slow lane. And so eventually it might still get too warm in some places for moose, for example. But maybe there's another species that still needs it cool and not cold, just cold. So we can think about this for brook trout. What is the cool species that's coming up behind it? And so those places might be still really important to protect, even if in 50 to 100 years, that target species that we were originally protecting it for can no longer persist there. Well, the next thing that's going to be shifting up from the south, for example, or up from lower elevation could. So with that, we have lots of information on our website. Happy to have you explore there, send us any questions, and the special issue is available, and yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, guys. That was great. That was perfect. Would you be willing to put a link to the special issue in the chat?
Sure thing.
And everybody can turn their cameras on if you want. And since this is a small group, we can just have a conversation here. I know, anyhow, you can start with questions. If anybody has any questions for Tina or Toni Lynn.
I have a question, or a request from further discussion of the citizen science component. So you mentioned it with Joshua Tree, and I'm just interested what they did and also what you see as the role for others to participate in, for example, ground truthing and other things with these modeled refugia.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you a little bit what they did, but I think it's so applicable that maybe we can just immediately start talking about what we could do in the Northeast. So they had people both I'll put the link to that paper as well. Some of that information's in the special issue paper he did, but some of it's in his own paper. So one of the things was measuring in terms of sort of size and growth rate, I think, of the Joshua trees there, but a big thing was just looking for regeneration. And so that just feels like something that's it was Earthwatch. Yes, thank you for that. Right. That feels so feasible and really important, because when we're talking about trees, right? So this is a lot harder for any other of the species we care about, but the trees can tell us that this is a good place. And we know that for the most part, this is a big caveat, but short of pest destruction, and really severe drought, which for the most part, we haven't had to deal with those kind of wide deaths in the Northeast, although I just came from a couple weeks in California and it was intense. But for the most part, if a tree is established, right, it's going to be there for a couple hundred years. And so if we can get people out there to help us see where regeneration is happening, of course, like I know that's complicated by deer and earthworms and all kinds of things. So if it's not happening, that's not necessarily because of climate, but if it is happening, then we're probably good for a while. And so that feels like a really good place for citizen scientists, because it also doesn't take deep expertise, like especially in northeastern forests. We can get people to recognize 10 tree species or something, then we're pretty good, and they can go out and tell us if there may be trees there. But I'm sure you all have more ideas and more expertise about this than I do.
Well, and that's one of the things that we think about a lot, is because the Refugia maps that we produce all come from these modeling frameworks that we develop, right? And so there's a real need for validation. And that's something that I have experienced in my, 1 year so far at this postdoc, is a lot of conversation about, okay, we've got these maps, we've got these projections. One of the ways that we approach validation is because we are working so closely with managers and stakeholders who are on the ground actively engaged in conservation for these species. They can potentially say, like, most of my modeling work is for a frog species that's the stream obligate in California. So those practitioners are out in the streams, and they're able to kind of validate my model projections and say, like, yeah, these places look good, these places don't, because actually there's a ton of bullfrogs here, and that's not something that's incorporated in your model. But actually that citizen science component, if we could develop a better approach to have citizen science data collected and used for validation, would be a huge win, because it's a real need, I think, in refugia modeling, is ways to do on the ground validation for our projections.
Is it just presence absence data, or is it also health, some sort of condition? I mean, right, because we've had people out mapping black crowberry around Big Moose Island and Little Moose Island here at Schoodic. Well, and so like they've just been doing presence absence. Is that really what is most important, not anything about condition?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. Tina and I don't know anything about crowberry. So you would all be more the experts than us. When we're thinking about long-term, just present absence is a start, like Tina said, since these models, we don't believe them until somebody tells us that, like, it seems like, and so if we could be saying, like, yeah, this is a great refugium for them, and they don't even exist there, and people know that there's a good reason why. And so just as a start of them being present, that's a great sort of like, okay, that's a great starting point. If there's a reason to think that we could identify why the health is bad, then I think that could be really helpful information. I think that we're still just at the point of trying to incorporate the presence absence data. That's sort of that would be great, good enough for now kind of thing. But yeah, I don't know, Tina, if you have a different answer to that.
No, I just was going to say that, especially when you extend beyond the park scale. So for the refugia mapping for the Northeast, or even what I'm doing, which is a part of California, but bigger than just a couple parks, we don't even have absence data. All we have is presence data, and then we're generating pseudo absences. And so I think that would be fantastic if you could use, and especially if you're doing really localized refugia mapping that's in a single park, integrating condition data would be fantastic. But I mean, that's even leveling up from, I think, where we are now, which is just getting good presence absence data sets is a challenge.
Yeah, it seems like the next level would be what you were saying about regeneration, like seeing signs that reproduction is happening there, that there aren't just like, I don't know exactly how to do that with crowberry, Hannah, but if there were signs of young individuals, like reproduction, seedlings in the early spring or something.
Or would it not just be fruit? I mean, I know that fruit is not necessarily reproduction, but at least it's an attempt at reproduction.
Yeah, it's the start of the process for sure. But yeah. So anyhow, I think that's a great point. Hannah, do you want to describe a little bit about that? Just kind of briefly about what the technicians doing here to validate the and look at the refugia that were mapped here in Acadia?
I don't I don't know if, are you asking me to pull up a Refugia map? Because I don't think I could do that.
No,
But
no.
really,
Just what are they're going
okay,
out and
here.
monitoring stuff, right?
And you know what, to Tina's point, they are only doing presence. If they didn't, they walked around Big Moose Island and around Little Moose Island, and wherever they found black crowberry, they then stretched out transects, and across whatever 20-meter transects in a cross format, and just then dropped pins and said, it's here, it's here, it's here, it's here. So we know where it is and how much is in these plots, but in between the plots, it's pseudo not there, because we don't have any. They walked the whole perimeter of both islands, and wherever we don't have data, they didn't find it. But there's no zeros, like, except in their little plots. You will never see 0, 0, 0, 0, and then information. So that's what they've done, and they've gone around both of those islands. I don't think they've done anything up the peninsula from Big Moose or Little Moose, and they certainly have not gone over to MDI and done anything over there. And actually, Shannon and I were having a side chat, and we were thinking, oh, they also haven't gone to like up to Petite Manan or up to Great Wasp, some of those places that on your initial map looked like they were a brighter color than was even Scudic. Would you mind going back to that?
Yeah, sure. And
slide?
So one of the awesome things I could imagine doing next is so we've got this map. You then can overlay where you found them, and the places where you find them, and we say that it's refugial. Those seem like a good place, right? To think, okay, we know they're there, so that's real data. This is like some indication that we think they'll be there in the future. Sorry, just did something funny. And so that's and I don't know what those actions are. I'd be very curious to think about that. So one trick you can do in Zoom is if you go I don't think I can do it on my screen, but if you go to the top, you have usually have a zoom option in Zoom in case you're still look closer. But obviously we can also get you this map in a way that doesn't have keys covering it and stuff.
Yeah, because I think it would be very, I think that the next point of land over, right, is going to Petite Manan, which is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service location, where originally Netton had talked about setting up one of their long-term studies. So anyway, I know there's a relationship between, obviously the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service. So I don't think it would be that difficult to send a team, depending on time, over and just doing presence absence in Petite Manan.
And when you look at this is really exciting. When you look at this, does it seem like, yeah, that's where I thought they would be, or that's where they are, or whatever? Does it seem right?
Yes.
I think, what is this one showing?
So, this is saying in 2080 where we think they'll be.
Okay.
And that's if, climate change doesn't hit us quite as hard as we think it will. This is if climate change does hit us as hard as we think it might, they basically won't be around anymore. So this one's sort of hard to look at because that yellow is almost no occupancy. But, there are other ways to encourage persistence of species. So, there are its climate niche, there's its climate needs, but we know that, just we can have plants in our backyard that maybe don't totally live here, but we make sure they get watered extra or something, so there's ways in which if you decide it's really important because of indigenous practices or whatever it is, this is something we really want to resist, there are actions you can take. And so that's something to think about. If black crowberry is really important, you know, there's the more passive things, like that's where you focus on making sure invasives aren't taking over, or that like people aren't hiking through, or they're not picking the berries or whatever. But there's obviously also like more involved actions that could be taken as well.
So just to kind of go back to your Northeast work, a little bit away from the Acadia specific bit, like thinking at the larger landscape, are you like, I may have missed this, but are you at a stage, or is there a likely next stage to be like, how do we apply these to individual parks and also to the like large landscape? Because like you were talking about like particularly trying to target actions on the refugia where folks are likely to be the longest, but also thinking about those kind of transitory ones that might be important for connectivity or in the shorter run. And is there, in the workshops that you guys had with, or in your thinking for future stages, are there thinking about like how to organize people to think about those, preserving those at the regional scale?
Yeah, and then I can start, and then Toni Lynn maybe fill in behind me. So there was I was not a postdoc, I was still a grad student when those first workshops happened identifying priority species. But there was a third workshop that kind of wrapped everything up when Sarah was finishing up. And it was designed to do just that. I don't think we're as far as we need to go in terms of taking these maps and identifying a plan for on the ground actions. But so Sarah produced park by park maps for each of the species that identified refugia and transition areas. And then we reconvened the stakeholders to basically talk about like, okay, we have these maps, you have these maps. What is the format in which they're most useful and most accessible to you? And then B, with these maps, what do you think you're going to do with them? And so we did hear kind of some ideations of next steps, like, oh, well, we could use this for, you know, thinking about where we manage for X, or like where we wouldn't want to manage for Y. But I think we still need kind of that next step. Feels like we're still missing the step that gets us to like on the ground action, I think. So hopefully that will be coming next.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And I'll add on both those points. So one is Tina's putting together the manuscript for this now. And the step that I think you were working on like today or yesterday was looking at like which parks have in the Northeast region have the most refugia and like which species are so for, in this case, transition, we mean like what species is Acadia going to be getting? And that's as important, right, as we're thinking about long-term. In the Northeast, I think we play better together than in some other regions in the country, partly because our parks are so small, we kind of have to, right? And so this project was definitely made as like a regional project, not just like, you know, frankly, besides Acadia and Shenandoah and the Appalachian Trail and a few others, like everything is very, very small. So it doesn't really make sense to like map refugia for these very, very small parks. We have to think about the buffers and the like parks around. So we're trying to help identify like where the refugia for these 50-ish, 60-ish species that were priorities, at where will the refugia remain? And then are there places where those species are going to move into that those parks want to be thinking a little bit more about those, managing those species as they like come into their park. So that's happening. On the action part, right? So everything Tina said, I guess, Abe, I would say back to all of you, I'm struggling a little bit because I keep having the conversation about like, yeah, so what should we do? And I just think I'm not the right lead on it, frankly. Like I as the scientist, I'm very happy to like be told, yeah, please go map this for us and then come back. But like, the best I feel like I can do is kind of facilitate a conversation about like, what do you want to do here? But like, I can't say, go do these things. And I can't even imagine what the things are, except from what I've heard from all of you over the last 15 years of doing this. And so, you know, I mean, just like so much of what our lives have been in the last couple of years, like I said, this project started like the day after COVID started, you know, it's all been a little different than we expected, but I am ready and available for any conversations and any like work that needs to be done to think about whether it's Acadia or the, you know, Northeast region in general or whatever, whoever, to think about like, what can we do with these maps so that it's helpful to all of you. And like, I love that conversation we just had about the crowberry, because that feels very like, that's the next step, is like, what is happening? Like, actually, where are people going physically? How can we help inform that? What is like the specific like cutting and chemicals and building and things that are happening that this could inform? And we have, in case you don't know, I'll drop the link, but we have a national and regional network on invasive species and climate change. I'm very active with thinking about invasive species management. I know that's a huge piece of this. And so, although I don't talk about it, I feel like those are very connected, because I know there's just way too many invasive species to deal with. Can't do it all. And so this is like a way to say, okay, here's some places maybe to focus.
Well, I'll let somebody else take a question, but I'll just put a little seed of an idea. If Toni Lynn, if you end up, or Tina, if you, I know you interact with folks on the invasive species and the like assisted migration stuff, or and the refugia stuff, but if you hear that, and I'll try to do it on my end, but there may be a place for a regional workshop at some point to talk about these three things, kind of complement. They all intersect, and I think that would be, doing all three at the same time would probably be the way we would, for the parks, to think about how do we think regionally about these three things, because they're all regional issues, and so how do we coordinate in the Northeast around those? Anyhow, something to think about. I don't know, right now our resource management staff is thin our regional level, and so when they rehire, we might be in a better position to take that on. But if it comes up in the assisted migration workshop or any others that are coming up, something to think about. Any other questions from folks?
I have a question, and I mean not to round back to the black crowberry, which is oh so important to us here at Scudic. By the way, great talk. I'm just getting my mind wrapped around the fact that refugia is not only for the species that are being potentially like pushed out, but also pushed in. So I'm having to reframe my mindset of the—
Yeah, it took me about 12 years to get there. So you may have heard me 6 years ago say, never say that again. That's not true. So don't worry if it's taking you a minute.
It's just taking me that spare moment, like you said, protecting the spaces for species that will get pushed into them. And I was like, what an odd thought, ecology, but I love it. So thank you for all of that and helping me get that mindset on track. I just have a question on the black crowberry maps you showed that had you show up again. Were those from the RPub's interactive SCS map page online?
Yes, unfortunately. Okay, so Jen Smetzer now works for Fish and Wildlife Service as one of their, like the SSA team. She's got this awesome National Fish and Wildlife Service job now. So she is available and doing other things at the same time. That RPub's link is no longer active. She was paying money for it and there was a little miscommunication and it stopped working. So yeah, it's like a tragedy. So but that doesn't mean we can't get you the information. It's just not the slider sort of thing anymore.
Totally. That would be epic if you could send those along, because I immediately went to go share that with the folks working on black crowberry and was like, is it me or does this link just lead nowhere? Okay. Good to know. Thank you if you're able to share any
Absolutely.
about that. And again, excellent talk. And thank you for helping frame that mindset.
Another thing, just Shannon's point made me remember that we have a researcher here, Chris Nadeau, who had a study out recently. I'll put it here in the chat, showing that the cool micro refugia are likely to become kind of biodiversity hotspots on the landscape. So not only will they be important for the species, I mean, basically exactly the point you're making, that they're going to be important for species that are there now and for species that are coming. And as a result, they'll become some of them biodiversity wise, the most important locations on the landscape as climate changes, which is cool. Also kind of another selling point for thinking about, well, why it's important to think about these refugia and manage them carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. That's super cool to see from Chris. Thanks. I would say maybe to wrap up that Acadia, we all know Acadia is very special. And there's ways in which how you think about Acadia as being special, like back to your point, Shannon, it's going to change in the next century. But if we think of it a little bit more broadly, that Acadia is special in that, at least in the National Park Service Northeast region, it holds these colder or cooler environments, and they're buffered because they're coastal, and there's a lot of things there. Those are still going to be true, even if you warm 2 degrees. And so that I think we can think about that as like Acadia as a refugium for the region now, and Acadia as a refugium, macro refugium in a century. It just may be for different things than it is now. And again, that reinforces this idea that we need to be working regionally and talking regionally and sharing resources, because I think it's still going to be a place where you're going to hold a lot of the biodiversity within the Park Service for the Northeast region, even as you do now, you will that in the future, even if maybe that the like actual players, the protect the stage thing, the players will have changed.
Very good point. We're very worried about our red spruce, which dominates our forest, but as we lose them, we'll gain more species. So biodiversity will click up, even though as we lose our big players right now. But thank you guys very, very much, Toni, Lynn, and Tina. This was awesome. Really appreciate you taking the time, and look forward to continuing to work with you going forward. And it sounds like we will definitely be following up with questions and for you, and hopefully be sharing results from here with you going forward too. So thank you, and we'll post the recording. We'll let you know when it gets posted.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, love it. Thank you so much. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, keep up the great work.